The champagne flute shook slightly in my hand, but I held it steady. I had held steadier things under harder circumstances. IV lines at 3 a.m, a newborn baby in a parking lot, a single paycheck that had to stretch across 14 days. A champagne glass was nothing. The room went quiet the moment I stood up. 240 people in the Harrington Grand Ballroom turned to look at me, a 63-year-old woman in a burgundy dress she had bought on sale at Macy's, standing between the centerpieces and the dessert table, with nothing but the truth and 31 years of patience on her side. My son's future mother-in-law stared at me from across the room. Her face had gone the color of old chalk. I smiled at her. I wanted her to know I had been waiting a very long time for this moment. But let me start at the beginning, because a story like this one doesn't make any sense unless you know where it came from. My husband died on a Thursday in October. My son was 4 years old. He was sitting in the living room watching cartoons when I got the call, and I remember thinking before I could even process the words the officer was saying that I needed to turn down the volume on the television so I could hear clearly. I turned it down. I heard clearly. And then I sat on the kitchen floor for 45 minutes while my son watched his cartoons in the next room, completely unaware that our entire life had just been rearranged. His name was Daniel, my husband. He worked construction. It was a scaffolding collapse, one of those accidents that makes the local news for 2 days and then disappears, because there's always another tragedy waiting. The company settled. The settlement was enough to cover the funeral and 3 months of rent. After that, it was just me. I was 32 years old with a 4-year-old, a nursing certification, and a 1-bedroom apartment in Raleigh, North Carolina. I did not have the luxury of falling apart for very long. I went back to work at the hospital 10 days after the funeral. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Aldridge, watched my son in the mornings. I worked the day shift and came home by 4. I made dinner. I read bedtime stories. I fell asleep on the couch with his little sneakers still untied on my lap more times than I can count. It was not a glamorous life. It was not the life I had imagined. But it was ours, and I protected it with everything I had. My son's name is Caleb. He was a quiet child who became a serious teenager, and then, somehow, an extraordinary young man. He was the first person in my family to finish college. He graduated from NC State with a degree in architecture and then got his master's from Georgia Tech. He called me the night he got his acceptance letter, and we both cried on the phone for 10 minutes before either of us could say anything useful. I worked 31 years at the same hospital. I started as a floor nurse, moved into administration in my 40s, and retired 2 years ago as the Director of Patient Services for the entire Eastern region. I was proud of that. I had earned every single word on that title. And I want to be clear about something. I never told Caleb about the hard parts unless it was necessary. I didn't want him carrying the weight of my sacrifices on his back. I wanted him free. I wanted him to walk into his future without looking over his shoulder at what it had cost me to get him there. Maybe that was a mistake. I've thought about it since, but I stand by it because I would do it the same way again. Caleb met his fiancée about 3 years ago. Her name is Reese. She's a tax attorney, sharp and funny, with a laugh that fills a room and an ability to argue any position with equal confidence and charm. I liked her immediately. Genuinely liked her, not the polite, performative liking that mothers sometimes do when they know they have no choice. Real warmth. She called me on my birthday. She asked me questions about nursing and actually listened to the answers. She held Caleb's hand the right way, not possessively, but like she was glad to be beside him. I told Caleb he had done well. He laughed and said he knew. The trouble was not Reese. The trouble was her mother. Her mother's name is Patricia Holloway. She and her husband, Robert, had built a commercial real estate empire in Charlotte over the past 2 decades. They had the kind of money that announces itself quietly in the cut of a jacket, in the ease of a room reservation, in the particular way someone never once checks a price. They owned a home in Myers Park with a circular driveway and a catering kitchen. They had a membership at a club I had only ever driven past. Patricia was a woman who had decided somewhere along the way that her worth was best measured in contrast to other people's limitations. She didn't say cruel things bluntly. She was far too practiced for that. She said them sideways, with a tilt of the head and a sympathetic smile that never quite reached her eyes. The first time I met her was at a dinner at their home, about 6 months after Caleb and Reese got serious. I wore my best blazer. I brought a bottle of wine that the man at the shop had told me was well regarded. Patricia accepted it with 2 fingers and set it on a side table without looking at the label. Over dinner, she asked me what I did. I told her I was recently retired from hospital administration. Administration, she repeated. The way you might repeat a word in a foreign language you are still learning. So you were a nurse? I was a nurse, yes. And then director of patient services. She touched her napkin to the corner of her mouth. That must have been exhausting. All those years on your feet. It was not a compliment. I had been a nurse long enough to know the difference between someone expressing sympathy and someone expressing condescension. She was doing the latter, efficiently and with a smile. Robert was friendlier or at least quieter about his opinions, which amounts to the same thing in polite company. He asked about Raleigh, whether I planned to stay there in retirement, what my grandchildren's situation was. He seemed genuinely curious or genuinely bored. It was hard to tell. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the parking garage of my apartment complex for a few minutes before going inside. I wasn't upset, exactly. I had dealt with difficult people my entire career. Doctors who spoke to nurses like furniture, administrators who confused authority with intelligence, family members in crisis who needed someone to be angry at. I knew how to absorb it and move on. But I noted it. I filed it away in the place I keep things that might matter later. Over the following months, there were other moments. Small ones, individually dismissible, the kind that you would sound petty complaining about. At Thanksgiving, Patricia mentioned 3 times that Reese had graduated summa from Duke. The 3rd time, she glanced at me as she said it, as though the information might land differently the 3rd time around. At a birthday lunch for Reese in the spring, Patricia told a story about a charity gala they had attended and referred to the servers as the help, with a gesture that suggested this was a category of people she thought about frequently and distinctly. She asked me once, in front of 4 other people, whether I had a financial advisor or if that wasn't really necessary at my level of retirement. I told her I managed my own investments. She said how resourceful in a tone that implied the opposite. I did not say anything. I was a guest in her world, and Caleb was happy, and Reese was wonderful. And I had not survived 31 years of night shifts and budget hearings and raising a child alone to let a woman with a circular driveway take my piece. But I watched. And I remembered. The engagement party was scheduled for June. Patricia insisted on hosting it. She wanted the Harrington Grand Ballroom at the hotel downtown, 240 guests, a live string quartet, past hors d'oeuvres, the kind of event where the napkins are folded into shapes. She sent Reese a 14-page document outlining the vision. Reese told me about it on the phone and laughed, a little helplessly. It's become her project, she said. I've just decided to let her have it. Is that terrible? Not at all, I said. Pick your battles. You're very wise. I'm very tired, I said. And she laughed again. I was on the guest list, naturally. I was given a table near the back table 11, which I noted without comment. The couple's table was at the front. The Holloway family occupied tables 1 through 3. I was surrounded by people I didn't know, colleagues of Robert's mostly, and a few of Patricia's friends from her garden club. I wore the burgundy dress. I had my hair done the day before. I brought nothing to that party, except my presence and what I knew, which, as it turned out, was enough. The evening started pleasantly enough. The room was beautiful. Patricia had taste, whatever else I thought of her. The flowers were white and green and architectural. The lighting was warm. Caleb looked so handsome that I had to breathe carefully when I saw him, because he looked like his father in the best possible way, and there are moments even now when that still catches me off guard. Reese was radiant. She came to find me early in the evening and hugged me with real feeling and told me she was glad I was there. I told her she looked beautiful. She told me the dress had been her grandmother's idea, altered. She seemed happy and slightly overwhelmed and completely certain about the man standing beside her. I felt, watching her, the particular relief of knowing your son is loved correctly. For the first hour, everything was fine. I ate the past appetizers. I spoke with the people at my table, a retired physician and his wife who were charming company. I watched Caleb and Reese move through the room together, easy and unhurried, and I felt under everything a deep and uncomplicated pride. Then came the toasts. Robert went first. He was gracious, genuinely funny, clearly in love with his daughter in the straightforward way of fathers who have never had to question it. He told a story about Reese at 7 years old, negotiating an extension on her bedtime with such meticulous logic that he had ultimately agreed just to end the debate. The room laughed. Caleb beamed. Then Patricia stood up. She tapped her glass, smoothed her dress, a thing of considerable engineering in pale gold, and smiled at the room with the particular brightness of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for some time. She spoke about Reese first, beautifully. Actually, she had clearly prepared, and she knew her daughter. Then she turned to the subject of Caleb. "We are so pleased," she said, "to be welcoming Caleb into our family. He is a remarkable young man, self-made, you might say." A pause, a smile. Given his background, the way she said it, that slight hesitation before background, the small curve of her mouth, I felt the people at my table go very slightly still. "He worked so hard," she continued, "from such modest circumstances. It really is inspiring." Another pause. Of course, we don't all have the same starting point in life. Some of us simply have to work harder to arrive at the same place. She said it to the room, but her eyes found mine at table 11. Just for a moment, just long enough. I set down my champagne glass. My table neighbor, the retired physician, glanced at me. I did not look at him. I was looking at Patricia Holloway, who had returned to smiling at the room, satisfied, the words already dissolving into the warm air of the ballroom as though they had never been spoken. Some people would have let it go. I have let many things go in my life. I have learned the difference between battles that matter and ones that merely feel urgent. I have apologized when I wasn't wrong, conceded when it cost me nothing important, and absorbed indignities that I knew I couldn't afford to answer. But I thought about Caleb. I thought about the way he had heard those words, modest circumstances, same starting point, the polite architecture of a woman reminding my son on the night of his engagement that she considered his mother a step down. And I thought about something else. Something I had found 6 months earlier while going through old files, not looking for anything in particular, just a woman doing what retired women sometimes do, organizing the paper residue of a life. I stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. Rooms rarely do when someone at table 11 stands up. But I had spent 30 years managing hospital floors, which means I had spent 30 years learning how to make a room pay attention without raising my voice. I picked up my champagne glass. I held it the way I had learned to hold difficult things steadily, without gripping too hard. "I'd like to say something," I said, "if I may." Caleb looked at me from the front of the room. His expression was careful and loving and slightly worried, all at once. Reese had taken his hand. "I want to thank the Holloway family for this beautiful evening," I said. "Patricia, this room is stunning. You have extraordinary taste, and I mean that sincerely." She inclined her head, still smiling, still certain of the shape of the evening. "I also want to say something about starting points," I said. "Since the subject has come up." The room was quiet now. "I raised my son alone," I said. "His father died when Caleb was 4 years old in a construction accident, and after that it was just the two of us. I worked the night shift. I studied for my administrator's certification on my lunch breaks. There were years when I budgeted down to the dollar, and I don't say that for sympathy, I say it because Caleb saw all of it. He saw what it looked like to keep going when going was hard." I paused. I was not performing. I was simply telling the truth, which in my experience doesn't require much embellishment. "Caleb didn't come from money," I said. "He came from something rarer than money, and I am proud of that every single day." I let that settle for a moment. Then I looked at Patricia directly, and I said what I had come to say. "Patricia, I believe you know the name Southeastern Regional Medical Partners. You purchased a significant stake in their network about 17 years ago, just before their Charlotte expansion. That deal was the foundation of Holloway Properties' move into medical real estate, which became, if I remember correctly, your most profitable portfolio." She was very still. "What you may not know," I said, "is that Southeastern Regional was nearly insolvent the year before that deal." They had a significant compliance problem, billing irregularities that were going to trigger a federal audit, the kind of audit that closes organizations. I kept my voice even. I had delivered difficult information to frightened people my entire career. I was on the State Health System Advisory Board that year. We spent 4 months quietly helping them restructure their compliance framework before the audit window closed. It was not glamorous work. It was the kind of work that happens in conference rooms at 6 in the morning, and it is the reason that organization still existed when you arrived to invest in it. The room was absolutely silent. I don't say this to take credit, I said. I say it because starting points are complicated, and sometimes the path that looks modest from the outside is the one that was holding everything else up. I raised my glass. To Caleb and Reese, I said, may they build something real. 240 people raised their glasses. Someone started to applaud, and then more people did, and within a few seconds the sound filled the room in a way that made the string quartet put down their instruments and join in. Patricia Holloway was not applauding. She was sitting very still in her pale gold dress with an expression I recognized. I had seen it on people receiving bad news, the particular blankness of someone recalibrating everything they thought they understood about a situation. Robert, beside her, was looking at me with an expression that might have been respect or recognition or some combination of the two. Caleb was on his feet. He crossed the room and hugged me so hard that the champagne nearly went over, and he said quietly into my shoulder, "Mom, I didn't know any of that." "You weren't supposed to," I said. "It was before your time. Why didn't you ever tell me?" I pulled back and looked at him, this man I had read bedtime stories to, this man who had his father's jaw and my stubbornness and something entirely his own that neither of us could have predicted. "Because I didn't need you to know," I said. "I needed you to be free." He held my face in both hands for a moment, the way he used to when he was very small and wanted my full attention. Then he nodded, once, and let go. Reese hugged me next. She didn't say anything for a long moment. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, and she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as recognition, the look of a woman seeing something clearly for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for how she's been. None of that is yours to carry," I told her. The rest of the evening changed after that. Not dramatically, people are generally too well-mannered to let a dramatic evening stay dramatic. Conversations resumed. The string quartet played something from Vivaldi. The dessert table was opened, and it was spectacular. But things were different. Patricia came to find me near the end of the night. I was standing near the window, watching Caleb and Reese say goodbye to their guests, and I heard her heels on the marble behind me before I heard her voice. "Margaret," she said. I turned. She looked older somehow, though nothing had changed but the hour. She was holding her champagne glass with both hands, which was new. "I didn't know," she said, "about the advisory board." "No reason you would have," I said. A silence. "I owe you an apology," she said. It came out carefully, the way expensive things are unwrapped slowly, with attention to what's fragile. "I have not been kind to you." "No," I agreed. "You haven't." She flinched. Slightly. I think she had expected more softening. I had none to offer. "I don't know exactly what I thought." "I think you thought I wasn't worth your consideration," I said, not unkindly. "That happens. People look at a woman who came from a certain place, and they make a decision about what she must be." I looked at her steadily. "I have spent my entire career being underestimated by people with more money and less patience than me. I've outlasted all of them." She was quiet for a moment. "Reese loves your son very much," she said finally. "I know," I said. "That's the only thing about this situation that has never been in question." She nodded. She set her champagne glass down on the windowsill with the precise movement of a woman who has decided something. Then she held out her hand. I looked at it. I thought about 31 years. I thought about table 11. I thought about the way she had said modest circumstances with her eyes on mine. And then I thought about Caleb and Reese, who would be building a life together, and who deserved to do it without the weight of their mother's unfinished business dragging at the foundation. I shook her hand. "We should have lunch," she said, properly, without an agenda. "We should," I said. I made no promises about when. Some things need time to become possible, and honesty about that is its own form of respect. She nodded once more. Then she walked back toward her husband, and I turned back to the window, and I watched my son laugh at something his new fiancée whispered in his ear. That night, driving home on I-85 with the windows down and the radio playing something I only half recognized, I thought about the file I had found 6 months earlier. It was a carbon copy of a meeting summary from the advisory board 17 years old, my signature at the bottom, the name of the organization in the header. I had not gone looking for it. I had not saved it deliberately. I had simply been the kind of woman who keeps records, because keeping records is what you do when you have always had to account for your own existence. I had not planned the evening the way it might appear. I had not written a speech. I had stood up because Caleb's face, when Patricia said modest circumstances, had done something that a mother cannot see without responding. But I had known, for 6 months, that the information existed, and I had kept it quietly, the way I had learned to keep everything that mattered close, patient, ready. Caleb called me the next morning at 8 o'clock. "Good morning," I said. "How's the future husband?" "Very tired and extremely proud of his mother," he said. "Do you have coffee made?" "Always." "I'm coming over." He arrived 20 minutes later with a box of donuts from the bakery on Glenwood, the ones with the honey glaze that he had been bringing me since he was 14 years old and first discovered them. He sat at my kitchen table and ate 2 of them while I poured the coffee, and for a while neither of us said very much. We had always been comfortable in silence, the 2 of us. You get that way when it's just been you and one other person for a long time. "Tell me about the advisory board," he said finally. So I did. I told him about the year I spent 2 Saturdays a month in a government conference room reviewing compliance frameworks for healthcare organizations. About the particular case of Southeastern Regional, which had been a mess of overlapping billing codes and inadequately documented procedures, the kind of bureaucratic tangle that wasn't malicious, just careless, but careless in ways that regulators could not overlook. About the months we had spent restructuring their internal reporting systems before the audit cycle closed. About how the work had been invisible by design, because that was the point you made, the problem disappear before anyone knew how serious it had become. "You saved their organization," Caleb said. "We saved it," I said. "There were 7 of us on that subcommittee. But you were there. I was there." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in both hands. "Why did you never tell me?" "I've been trying to figure out how to answer that," I said honestly. I think I didn't want you to see me as someone who had done important things. I wanted you to see me as your mother. The big things I did because they were right, not because I needed them on record, and the small things I paused. The small things were just life. Getting you to school, making the rent, making the Tuesday casserole because it was your favorite. He smiled at that. The Tuesday casserole. Still make it. I know. He looked at me. I should have known more. About your work. About who you were outside of being my mom. You knew exactly who I was, I said. You just didn't have the vocabulary for it yet. He set down his coffee cup and leaned across the table and hugged me, the kind of hug that men give their mothers when they realize for the first time that their mothers were people before they were mothers, and that the person is still there, underneath everything. We sat there for a while longer. We finished the donuts. We talked about the wedding, which Reese had already started talking about, and whether I had any strong feelings about venues, and whether Caleb should be worried that the answer to that question appeared to be yes. I have thought a lot, since that evening, about what it means to be underestimated, about the particular experience of being a woman who has accomplished something real and lived in a world that was not especially interested in noticing. About the years I spent in rooms where my title was the last thing anyone looked at and the first thing they were surprised by. I don't hold the bitterness of it. I found that bitterness is expensive, and I have always been careful with my resources. But I think there is something important in the refusal to disappear. Something necessary in standing up, even at table 11, even late in the evening, even when the room wasn't expecting it. Not for revenge, not exactly. For accuracy. For the record. For the simple insistence that a life like mine be seen for what it actually was. My son is getting married in October. The venue is a restored mill property outside of Chapel Hill, with oak trees on 3 sides and a creek you can hear from the patio. Reese picked it. I cried when I saw the photographs, which I did not admit to Caleb, though I suspect he knows. Patricia and I have had lunch twice. It is not easy, exactly, but it is real, which is what I asked for. She is a complicated woman, and I am not a simple one, and we are proceeding carefully, which is, in my experience, the only way that complicated things ever manage to become straightforward ones. On the night of the engagement party, driving home with the windows down, I had passed the exit for the hospital where I had worked for 3 decades. The building was lit up pale against the night sky, all those windows, all those floors, all that invisible work that had gone on inside for 31 years, the decisions and the crises and the nights that never seemed to end and the mornings that eventually always came. I had not stopped, but I had looked. I had raised my son alone. I had done important work that no one had ever needed to know about. I had worn good shoes on a budget and kept records in case they were ever needed and gotten through every single Tuesday with the casserole on the table. And at a party in a ballroom full of people who were watching, I had stood up. I thought that was worth something. I still do.